A U.S. judge secretly blocked whistleblower reports about illegal government surveillance until Jasmine Crockett exposed her with a memo signed by the judge herself. What happened next shook the courtroom, and 27 million Americans watched it unfold. How did one woman force the truth into the light, risking her career to do it? And what exactly was in the folder that made the judge go silent? This is a story worth every second of your time. Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. It was early Monday morning in Washington, D.C., but inside the heavily fortified Congressional Oversight Building, the air already felt heavier than usual. The hearing was scheduled as routine, a closed-door session on alleged abuses within domestic surveillance programs. Most expected a quiet shuffle of legal jargon and redacted testimony. Then Jasmine Crockett walked in, a black attorney with a reputation for making liars squirm and institutions sweat. She didn't come to perform. She came to confront. Dressed in a sharp slate suit, eyes like fire behind calm glass, she didn't carry a briefcase. She carried a box, battered, taped shut, and heavier than it looked. Not with weight, with truth. Heads turned slowly. Whispers stopped. Jasmine didn't pause, didn't nod, didn't blink. She moved like someone who'd been dragged through the mud by the very system now asking her to testify, only to rise, unbroken. She was expected to submit, to soften her edge, maybe to crumble under the panel's pressure, but they didn't know her story. They didn't know the box she brought held documents they buried, names they erased, and signatures they thought would never surface. As she sat and placed the box on the table with a soft, echoing thud, the atmosphere shifted. This wasn't going to be another hearing. It was about to become a confrontation with everything they tried to hide. And seated at the helm of it all, gavel in hand, eyes like steel, was the one person Jasmine Crockett had never trusted to play fair. Judge Evelyn Hartley was a legend in D.C., not for fairness, but for control. Sharp-tongued, stone-faced, and utterly immovable, she ran her courtroom like a battlefield where only she held the map. Her record was pristine on paper, but beneath it lay years of buried complaints, sealed files, and rulings that always seemed to favor power over people. She didn't tolerate disruptions, especially not from voices like Jasmine's, young, black, unafraid. To Hartley, this wasn't a hearing, it was a test of obedience. She expected Jasmine to fold, to explain herself, to play by rules written in invisible ink. But what she didn't expect was for Jasmine to arrive ready to put her on the record instead. So when Judge Hartley finally leaned forward, her voice cold and calculated, the room braced, not for a question, but for the trap everyone knew was coming. "Ms. Crockett," Judge Hartley said, slow and deliberate, "this panel requires you to disclose the identity of the individual who provided you with the classified information regarding unauthorized surveillance programs." Her words echoed through the chamber like a loaded gun being cocked. The tone wasn't inquisitive. It was a demand dressed as due process. Jasmine sat still, her back straight, eyes locked forward, the kind of stillness that doesn't come from fear, but from knowing exactly what kind of fight you've walked into. Around her, aides glanced up from their notes. A junior congressman cleared his throat and then thought better of speaking. Even the cameras, previously indifferent, now zoomed in just a little closer. Jasmine didn't blink. She didn't flinch. She didn't even look at the judge right away. Instead, she let the silence stretch just long enough to make it uncomfortable. Then calmly, she turned her head and said, "Let me understand this, Your Honor." Her voice level but unmistakably cutting. "You're asking me to expose someone who risked everything to reveal a crime, just to satisfy the very person who helped cover it up?" The air tightened. One of the panelists shifted in their seat. Another scribbled something they'd never expected to write. Jasmine kept going, voice unwavering. "You want me to light the match that burns the whistleblower alive, when the person who lit the fire in the first place is sitting on that bench?" Her eyes never left Hartley's. It wasn't defiance for show. It was a mirror being held up to power, and power didn't like what it saw. Judge Hartley's jaw tensed, but she didn't interrupt. She couldn't, because in that moment everyone in the room understood exactly what Jasmine had just done. She hadn't refused the question. She had turned it inside out. She had made it clear that the real threat to justice wasn't the source, but the system demanding that source be sacrificed. And for the first time that morning, the balance of power began to shift, quietly, relentlessly, irreversibly. But Jasmine didn't come to play defense. She came to bring receipts, and now it was time to show the first one. She reached down without a word, her movements deliberate, quiet, and controlled. The box sat at her feet like a loaded weapon, plain, brown, and unremarkable on the outside. But inside it held something far more explosive than any headline. With a soft click, she undid the latches and slowly lifted the lid. The cardboard creaked in the silence, and the whole room leaned forward, not physically but mentally, instinctively. Everyone could feel it. Something was about to change. Jasmine didn't fumble. Her hand slipped inside and emerged with a single sheet, protected by a transparent sleeve, held between two fingers like a scalpel. She raised it to eye level, letting the overhead lights hit the top of the page, where a thick, unmistakable stamp burned across the margin. Declassified. 7:42 a.m. this morning. The red ink glowed like a warning flare, and then, lower down the page in bold black print, neat, official, irrefutable, was a signature that made the room freeze. Evelyn M. Hartley. Jasmine turned the document outward, facing the panel, making sure the cameras had a clean shot. Her voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Let's stop pretending," she said calmly. "You wanted to know where this information came from. It came from a memo, signed by the judge presiding over this hearing." Gasps didn't come loudly. They came in sharp intakes of breath, side glances, pens dropped quietly onto legal pads. The silence that followed wasn't disbelief, it was recognition. Everyone in that room knew what they were looking at. It wasn't just a piece of paper, it was a confession hiding in plain sight. But the signature was only the beginning. What the document said was far more damning than whose name was on it. The room watched as Jasmine laid the memo flat on the table, pressing it gently with both hands like she was anchoring something dangerous from blowing the lid off the hearing. Her voice was calm but unflinching. "This document confirms that, in the weeks leading up to the midterm elections, Judge Evelyn Hartley issued a directive to delay the transfer of whistleblower complaints to the proper congressional oversight channels." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "Not for legal review, not for national security, but for optics." The panelists stared frozen. Jasmine continued, flipping the page slightly to expose the next line, highlighted and unmistakable. "Recommend postponement to avoid risk of institutional narrative conflict during electoral cycle." The phrase sounded clinical, even harmless, but everyone in that room knew exactly what it meant. It meant truth was treated like a liability. It meant someone in power had chosen to shield political convenience over constitutional accountability, and that someone was sitting 10 feet away, silent. Jasmine looked directly at Judge Hartley now, voice unwavering. "You didn't suppress these reports because they lack credibility. You suppressed them because their timing made the truth inconvenient." Her words weren't angry. They were surgical. Hartley, once known for controlling every word in her courtroom, didn't interrupt, didn't shift, didn't blink. Her silence wasn't poise, it was paralysis. This was a woman who had dominated courtrooms for decades, who had cut down attorneys with a single raised eyebrow. But now, seated above the truth she once buried, she had nothing to say. The chamber didn't erupt. It didn't need to. The stillness said everything. No one shuffled their papers. No one reached for their coffee. The hearing had shifted into something else entirely. Not a procedure, but a reckoning. And at the center of it stood Jasmine Crockett, holding not just a piece of paper, but proof that power had chosen silence over justice. Until now. But Jasmine wasn't finished, because behind every buried memo, there's always a trail, and this time, it led straight to Judge Hartley's inbox. Jasmine reached into the box again, slower this time, as if choosing the next piece of evidence required precision, not just for impact, but for truth. She pulled out a printed set of emails, government format, official headers, date stamps clear and bold. Her fingers pinched the corner of the top page as she raised it toward the panel. "This," she said, voice steady and low, "is an internal communication from the Office of Legal Counsel addressed directly to Judge Hartley's chambers. She handed copies to the clerk, who moved faster now, the room no longer relaxed but alert. The contents are not redacted. The language is not vague. It reads, advise holding transmission of surveillance-related data to congressional committees until political conditions stabilize. Jasmine paused, letting the words settle like dust before a storm. She looked up again, eyes hard. This wasn't bureaucracy. This wasn't legal review. This was coordination, designed to keep the people's representatives in the dark. The weight in the room deepened. Jasmine flipped to the second page, tapping a highlighted line. Risk of premature exposure ahead of midterm cycle identified as unacceptable. No one spoke. No one moved. This wasn't theory. It was proof. Judge Hartley hadn't just signed off on a delay. She had helped craft a message that made concealment sound procedural. Jasmine placed the email printouts on the desk like a final puzzle piece. This came from her office, and she said, not loud but undeniable. It didn't pass through her hands. It originated there. And in that moment, there was no space left to hide behind protocol. Only silence, and paper, and truth in plain black ink. But paper wasn't the only thing Jasmine brought. Some truths aren't just written, they're spoken, and this one was caught on tape. Jasmine reached into the box one last time, her movements slower now, deliberate, as if the final piece she was about to reveal deserved its own kind of silence. From a padded sleeve, she pulled out a small digital recorder, placed it carefully on the table, and looked directly at the panel. This recording, she said clearly, was obtained through protected legal channels. It captures a closed-door meeting between senior staff in the judiciary, discussing how to stall legal oversight requests. Her thumb hovered over the play button for a breath. Then she pressed it. The sound that followed was crisp. No distortion, no ambiguity. A male voice came through first. If we hold the transfer until after midterms, it softens the blow. Congress will move on. Then another, more cautious voice replied, we need Hartley to sign off on this. No movement unless she backs it. And finally, the one that made the entire room stiffen. We're not protecting institutions here. We're protecting the party. Let's not kid ourselves. Jasmine didn't react. She let the tape roll for its full 27 seconds. Then silence. The kind that hums in your ears. The kind that makes a courtroom feel like a locked vault with no exit. She looked around once slowly, then turned her eyes back to the bench. That recording wasn't vague. It wasn't out of context. And it wasn't hypothetical. Her voice didn't rise, but it sharpened with every word. It was clear, it was strategic, and it pointed directly to this bench. She tapped the recorder once with her finger. You asked me to name the source behind the revelations that brought us here today. Then she paused, long enough for every camera in the room to lock in. So I will. She gestured first to the memo, then to the email, and finally to the playback device still glowing red. The person who delayed justice, the person who tried to bury the warnings, the person who now demands I betray those who step forward. Her eyes locked with Hartley's. That person is you, Your Honor. And after the final piece landed, voice, memo, email, the weight of truth became too heavy for even the judge's silence to carry. For a long moment, no one in the room moved. Judge Evelyn Hartley, the woman who had commanded courtrooms with an iron tone and impenetrable stare, now sat frozen in place, rigid, stone-faced, but clearly unraveling beneath the surface. Her lips parted once, as if to speak, but no words came. Because what could she possibly say? Every line she might use to regain control had already been stripped bare by the evidence laid before her. Her gavel rested untouched. Her authority, once unquestioned, had dissolved into something thinner than the silence that now gripped the chamber. It wasn't that Jasmine Crockett had spoken louder. It was that her truth had been heavier, and it landed like a fist on marble. The panelists, once neutral, even skeptical, now shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One senator, who had entered the chamber with visible disinterest, leaned in toward the clerk and whispered something with urgency. Another, who had nodded politely during Hartley's opening remarks, now glanced at the exposed memo with a stunned kind of stillness. This wasn't a procedural hearing anymore. It had become something else. something dangerous, something historical. Reporters, previously waiting for a statement or a walkout quote, now scribbled frantically, eyes flicking from the documents to Hartley to Jasmine, as if trying to confirm this moment was actually happening. The balance had tilted, and no one knew if it would ever return. Cameras, which had remained still throughout most of the morning, now inched closer, not for drama, but for documentation. A quiet murmur moved across the press section as producers and correspondents realized the implications. A sitting federal judge, caught in her own paper trail, unable to offer a defense, and not by chance, not by mistake, but by design. It wasn't a gotcha moment. It was a slow, deliberate dismantling of deceit. Jasmine hadn't flailed. She hadn't ranted. She had brought truth like a scalpel and made every slice count. She didn't need a headline. She had just rewritten the story. Judge Hartley blinked, finally, but still said nothing. Her eyes, once sharp with calculated distance, now looked blurred. Somewhere between shock and disbelief, as if her mind was racing to find an escape hatch that no longer existed. Her silence wasn't the silence of control. It was the silence of collapse. The only sound in the room was the hum of the audio recorder still on the desk, its red light blinking like a heartbeat in a chamber that had none. Then slowly, Jasmine rose from her seat. She didn't rush, didn't glare, didn't gesture. She simply stood with the composure of someone who had walked through fire and come out holding the matchbook. Her voice when she spoke was low, not whispered, but quiet enough to make the room lean in to hear. "Justice doesn't need a stage," she said. "It just needs enough space to speak." She picked up the memo, then the email, then the recorder, handling each as if they were sacred pieces of a broken truth finally put back together. Her eyes moved to each panelist in turn, not demanding, not pleading, just letting them see her. Letting them feel what it meant to be a witness in a system that expected her to be a target. "For years," she continued, "this institution demanded obedience in the name of process, loyalty in the name of order, silence in the name of stability. But none of those things are justice. They're just excuses." Somewhere in the room, a reporter lowered her pen, too stunned to keep writing. A younger aide at the back whispered to his colleague, "This just flipped everything." And he was right, because in the span of 20 minutes, Jasmine Crockett had done something few ever imagined possible. She had put the system itself on trial and won. She walked to the center of the chamber now, not behind the desk, not above it, but within it. Not as a subordinate, not even as a challenger, but as a mirror. And the system didn't like what it saw in her reflection. "This court," she said, now turning back to Judge Hartley, "asked me for the name of my source." She took a breath. Her voice didn't tremble. It anchored. But sometimes the most dangerous secret isn't the source of the truth. It's the one trying hardest to bury it. She placed each document gently on the main evidence table. No theatrics, no final slam, just fact, just light, just silence. Then she looked straight ahead and spoke the final words that would echo beyond that room, into headlines, history books, and hearts. Truth doesn't need to shout. It only needs someone brave enough to hold the light steady while it speaks through the dark. And that was it. No applause, no gavel, no objection. Just silence. The kind that follows a reckoning. The kind that leaves the guilty staring down at their own signatures and wondering how long they believed no one would ever read them aloud. Outside the hearing room, the tone had already changed. Journalists were live streaming not summaries but turning points. Editorial boards were already calling emergency meetings. Congressional aides were drafting memos, real ones this time, calling for an independent review into judicial misconduct. The courtroom wasn't just stunned, it was shifting. The questions had changed, and now the court itself was the one being questioned. As Jasmine gathered her papers and turned to leave, she didn't look back. She didn't have to. Her job was done, not in the sense of victory, but in the deeper sense of witness. She hadn't just testified to what she knew. She had reminded the nation of what it had forgotten, that silence in the face of injustice isn't neutrality, it's complicity. But what happened inside that courtroom didn't stay behind those walls. Truth, once released, has a way of echoing far louder than the voices that tried to silence it. By nightfall, the country had seen it, not in fragments, not in filtered sound bites, but in full. The video of Jasmine Crockett's testimony wasn't just shared, it detonated. At first, it spread in waves. Legal bloggers, civil rights forums, a few Twitter accounts known for tracking government transparency. Then it hit cable news. Then it hit primetime. By 8 p.m., the full video was being played on a loop across the three biggest networks, unedited, uninterrupted. Her voice echoed from screens across airports, bars, hospital lobbies, and kitchens. Her words, measured, calm, sharpened by truth, cut through the static of daily noise like a blade. The line was everywhere. Truth doesn't need to shout. It only needs someone brave enough to hold the light steady while it speaks through the dark. That sentence wasn't just repeated. It was printed on headlines, burned into protest signs, carved into conversations on podcasts, live streams, news roundtables, and courtroom blogs. For some, it was validation. For others, it was a threat. But no one could look away, because Jasmine Crockett hadn't just spoken truth to power. She had done it in a room full of it, and left without flinching. By midnight, editorial boards from coast to coast had pulled emergency meetings. The New York Times ran the headline, "One woman, one folder, a whole system shaken." The Washington Post's lead read, "When a witness becomes the judge." But this wasn't just about sound bites or politics. This was about something far older, something deeper. For millions of Americans watching, the hearing didn't just reveal one judge's corruption, it revealed something they had long suspected but never heard confirmed out loud. That the system had rules for them, and no rules for those in robes. That behind every redaction was a decision, and behind every decision was a hand. And sometimes that hand was hiding more than the truth. The questions came fast and loud. On morning radio, commuters debated, if a federal judge can suppress whistleblowers, what else are they suppressing? In veteran groups, barbershops, union halls, since when did justice become selective? College campuses lit up with forums titled Power, Transparency, and the Public Right to Know. High school civics teachers paused their regular curriculum to dissect the hearing line by line. And through it all, Jasmine's voice remained steady, not because she was everywhere, but because the footage was. She wasn't making press appearances. She wasn't campaigning. She didn't need to. She had already said everything that needed to be said, on the record, under oath, with the system watching. Meanwhile, the ripple effect inside Washington was seismic. Congressional aides scrambled to draft oversight letters. Judiciary subcommittees convened closed-door sessions of their own. Some judges quietly deactivated social media accounts. Others issued press statements condemning political theater. But no one believed them. Not after hearing that recording, not after reading that memo, not after watching a judge go completely silent while the evidence bearing her own name sat glowing under courtroom lights. The Department of Justice, under mounting public pressure, announced an internal review. Not because they wanted to, but because they had no choice. Civil liberties organizations filed open records requests by the hour. FOIA portals crashed twice from volume. Whistleblower protection groups saw a record surge in inquiries. Even international watchdogs began asking questions. But while institutions scrambled to save face, something far more important was happening out in the open. A conversation had been reborn, one not driven by outrage but by clarity. What is the purpose of public office? Who gets to define national security? When does secrecy protect people? And when does it only protect power? These weren't academic questions anymore. They were dinner table questions, subway ride questions, Sunday morning coffee questions. And at the center of all of them stood Jasmine Crockett. Not as a politician, not as a pundit, but as a symbol of what happens when someone walks into the lion's den carrying nothing but facts. Yet through all the noise, few forgot the weight she carried into that hearing. Because for every headline she sparked, there was the unspoken burden she bore. The risk of being disbarred, the risk of being smeared, the risk of being dismissed, patronized, or worse, ignored. She stood alone that morning, no backing committee, no press team, Just a plain suit, a box of documents, and the unshakable conviction that the truth had waited long enough. And perhaps that's why it struck so deeply. Not because she was loud, but because she was right. She hadn't called for a revolution. She hadn't asked for applause. She had simply walked into a system that expected her to stay quiet, and she refused. That refusal echoed in the way the public responded. It wasn't just admiration, it was recognition. Recognition that justice wasn't supposed to be a performance. Recognition that transparency shouldn't come only after damage control. Recognition that when someone stands in front of the machine and says, "You don't scare me," the rest of us are reminded that we still have power too. In a country where trust in institutions had long been fractured, Jasmine didn't fix it. She didn't promise to. What she did was rarer. She made it clear that trust must be earned, not demanded. And once broken, it can't be patched with silence. The fallout was far from over. Hearings were reopened, subpoenas were issued. The court that once judged her now found itself under investigation. But Jasmine Crockett? She didn't gloat. She didn't claim victory. She stayed quiet. Because the truth had already spoken, and the country was still listening. The sound of Jasmine's footsteps leaving that courtroom hadn't even faded before the system she had just exposed began to shake from within. Judge Evelyn Hartley, once revered and feared across federal circles, was placed on immediate administrative leave. The order came not from a whisper campaign or political pressure, but from a unanimous motion inside the Judicial Conduct Oversight Committee. It wasn't just because of Jasmine Crockett's testimony. It was because of the evidence, the signatures, the emails, the recordings. It was because the paper trail had stopped being metaphor and became law. And now Hartley wasn't overseeing hearings. She was the subject of one. The federal investigation launched with surgical speed. Justice Department inspectors, accompanied by congressional staffers, arrived at Hartley's chambers by sunrise the next day. Files that had been marked sealed were unsealed. Emails thought deleted were recovered. Internal communications marked "do not circulate" were now under review by auditors, analysts, and legal scholars. The press called it unprecedented. Investigators called it overdue. And yet, even in the wake of that reckoning, the weight of injustice still lingered, especially for those who had nearly been destroyed by it. Two whistleblowers, names previously scrubbed from public record, careers nearly shattered, families pushed into hiding, were contacted directly by the Office of Legal Counsel. Not to be threatened this time, not to be silenced, but to be cleared. Their testimonies, once labeled inflammatory and in conflict with institutional interest, were officially reinstated into the case logs. Their warnings had been valid all along. Their concerns hadn't been disruptive. They'd been right. Federal protection orders were issued on their behalf. Charges previously threatened against them were dropped and erased. And for the first time in nearly 3 years, both individuals could walk into their workplaces, not as suspects, but as patriots. The public reaction didn't waver. If anything, it intensified. Legal panels across networks held emergency episodes. Podcast hosts shifted entire season schedules to cover the fallout. Law professors changed mid-semester curriculums to make room for the hearing transcript. One clip, Jasmine pointing to the bench and saying, "You asked for my source. The name is yours," was replayed more than 20 million times within the first 2 days. But the analysis went deeper than applause. It wasn't just about Hartley. It wasn't just about Jasmine. It was about what happens when a system built on secrecy finally collides with someone who has nothing left to lose, but everything to defend. Public ethics forums erupted with debate. Was the judiciary still accountable to the people? How many other truths had been buried in the name of procedural discretion? Were whistleblowers truly protected or simply tolerated until inconvenient? In one televised town hall, a moderator turned directly to the audience and asked, "When did we decide truth should wait until it's convenient?" The room fell silent. That silence spoke louder than any answer. Meanwhile, students in law schools from Harvard to Howard studied the Crockett-Hartley confrontation not as a trial, but as a case study in reversal. A moment where the rules of power didn't just bend, they broke. In lectures, professors paused to highlight one specific tactic Jasmine had used. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't posture. She didn't dramatize. She documented. She built a wall of truth so high and so solid, not even authority could climb over it. One evening, a nationally syndicated anchor, known for his scathing wit and aversion to sentiment, looked directly into the camera and said the line that would be repeated everywhere for weeks to come. "We just watched a woman flip a courtroom by making it put itself on trial." And that's exactly what it had been. A courtroom built for cross-examination had become the defendant's box. The judge's seat had become a spotlight. And Jasmine Crockett, armed only with declassified documents, one audio file, and an unshakable moral spine, had become the one holding the gavel. But none of it had come without a cost. Jasmine had faced pressure no one in the room could see. In the days leading up to her testimony, she'd received warnings, both subtle and not. Former colleagues told her to be careful. Political insiders reminded her of long-term reputational damage. Even allies hinted she should pick her battles. But she hadn't picked a battle. She'd answered a call. And now in the aftermath, her answer had become a national mirror. The system hadn't fallen, but it had been seen, clearly, publicly, and without excuse, and it couldn't unsee itself. The Federal Bar Association issued a rare statement applauding the integrity of public testimony in the face of institutional obstruction. The American Whistleblower Protection Coalition held its largest conference turnout in history, headlined by a panel titled, "Silence is Not Neutrality: Lessons from the Crockett Hearing." Even a few previously reluctant lawmakers, those known more for calculated statements than bold positions, found themselves cornered by public demand. They didn't just call for policy change. They called for oversight of the very people who had once been above questioning. But Jasmine said nothing. She didn't tour networks. She didn't accept interviews. She returned to her work. When asked why she didn't appear on talk shows or write op-eds, her spokesperson gave a simple answer. She already said what she needed to. On the record, under oath. That's where it matters. And perhaps that, more than anything, is why the moment endured. Because she hadn't done it for spectacle. She hadn't done it for legacy. She had done it because justice should not be seasonal, conditional, or optional. And now it wasn't. In committee halls, judges' chambers, university debate forums, in Sunday sermons, the name Jasmine Crockett became more than a headline. It became a signal, a reminder, that truth doesn't care about your title. It doesn't wait for your timing. And it doesn't lose power just because it makes powerful people uncomfortable. In the weeks that followed, a full inquiry into federal judicial oversight was launched. Subpoenas were issued, transparency mandates were passed. But even as the institutional gears began turning, the people, those watching, reading, learning, had already turned their eyes towards something far more important than headlines: accountability. And for once, they weren't asking it from the powerless. They were demanding it from the ones who claimed to speak in their name. That was the real shift, the real fallout. Because when a single courtroom moment cracks open a system, what pours out isn't just consequence, it's clarity. And Jasmine Crockett had delivered it without rage, without theater, without compromise. Just light, held steady, long enough for the country to finally see what had always been there. And yet, even as her name dominated headlines, hashtags, and hearings, Jasmine Crockett disappeared. Because some people don't chase the spotlight. They walk away from it to make room for something greater. The offers came fast. National networks, streaming giants, exclusive interviews, full-length profiles, podcast specials with bonus segments, and commercial-free tributes. Producers fought over airtime slots. Publicists scrambled to outbid each other for the chance to package her story. She was called the face of truth, a modern-day guardian of justice, the woman who made the bench answer for its sins. They offered cameras, columns, even book deals, 7 figures for 7 days of storytelling. But Jasmine Crockett didn't say no to the spotlight. She ignored it. While studio lights waited, she slipped out the back. While panels dissected her composure and viral clips racked up millions of views, she was already on a train. No press, no entourage, no escort. Headed back to the same city block where she first learned what justice felt like when it wasn't fair. Her phone rang for days. She let it. Emails flooded in. She archived them. PR agents pitched her memoir titles before she'd even unpacked her case files. But Jasmine had already chosen the one thing they couldn't offer her: peace without performance. Because this had never been about her. She didn't fight that courtroom war to be remembered. She fought it because no one else would. And now that it was over, at least publicly, she didn't want applause. She wanted work, real work, quiet, necessary, unfinished work. She returned to her small office on the south side of town. The sign outside hadn't changed in years. Crockett Legal Aid, Civil Rights, Tenant Defense, Community Law. The lights flickered when she walked in. Her inbox overflowed with housing disputes, unpaid wage cases, and immigration hearings. And she sat down, no fanfare, no statement, and got back to it, as if the world hadn't watched her dismantle a system on national television just days earlier. Inside that office, justice didn't wear robes. It came in the form of eviction notices, deportation threats, and fathers trying to see their children. It didn't care about hashtags or viral clips. It cared about rent due by Friday, about broken probation promises, about the small, constant grind of people getting steamrolled by power too far above them to see. Jasmine took her seat like she always had. Her desk, worn smooth from years of pro bono briefs, welcomed her back without ceremony. Her paralegal, who'd watched the hearing from a cracked phone screen, looked at her and said, "Are you sure you should be here?" Jasmine smiled, only slightly. "I was never supposed to be anywhere else," she replied. But that didn't mean she hadn't paid for her choices. In the days after the hearing, the backlash came in cold waves. Thinly veiled threats, anonymous messages about knowing where she lived, subtle warnings that her bar license could come under review, op-eds accusing her of grandstanding, of weaponizing optics, of undermining judicial independence. But she took it all the same way she took every case file that landed on her desk. She opened it, read it, and refused to flinch. Because Jasmine knew something most people in power forget. Spotlights burn out. Cameras move on. But the system, the one that nearly buried those whistleblowers, the one that told her to stay quiet, to stay in her lane, to not challenge the hand that holds the gavel, that system doesn't reform from interviews. It reforms when someone walks back into the dark corners and keeps doing the work without needing anyone to watch. She met with clients face to face, sat across from single mothers too afraid to ask for help, showed up to city zoning meetings with folders full of evidence, filed motions no one would ever tweet about. And when someone brought up the hearing, she would only say that was accountability. This, she gestured to the stack of unresolved legal aid forms, this is justice. The injustice she faced never fully left her. She carried it like weight stitched into her spine. Being a black woman in a courtroom designed to crush dissent meant she was always 10 seconds from being dismissed, misquoted, or discredited. But she turned that pressure into presence, into control, into something unshakable. Even the walls of her office seemed to remember it now. No gold plaques, no framed headlines, just one photo on her desk, her first client, hugging her after a landlord tried to illegally evict 3 generations of her family. That moment mattered more than a million retweets. And still, the spotlight searched for her. Producers reached out again, this time softer, more carefully worded. "We don't want to exploit it," they said. "We just want to honor what you did." Jasmine never responded. Her silence was louder than any interview, because the people who needed her already knew where to find her. In waiting rooms, in courthouses, in community centers, in the places where justice still showed up late, or not at all. And maybe, just maybe, that's what shook the system the most. Not that she fought back, not that she won, but that, when it was over, she walked away from the empire they tried to hand her and chose the street corner where justice still needs defending. No press conference, no farewell speech, just a closed door, a flickering light, and a woman behind a desk, head down, voice calm, fighting her next battle like no one was watching. Because the truth? She never needed them to watch. She only needed them to listen. But Jasmine Crockett hadn't just come back to work. She came back to build something no courtroom could ever tear down again. In the weeks after the dust settled, Jasmine did what no one expected her to do. She stopped reacting to the headlines and started designing a solution. Quietly, with no press release or podium, she registered a nonprofit from her legal office. The name was simple: the Shield Project. No slogans, no marketing team, just a mission etched into every document it processed: to protect the truth by protecting those who risk everything to tell it. Jasmine didn't want symbolism. She wanted structure, something real, something permanent. She had seen firsthand what happened when brave people tried to do the right thing in the wrong system. They were isolated, investigated, erased. That was the cost of integrity and silence. She was done watching it happen. The SHIELD project began with 3 staff members: a cybersecurity advisor who'd once been a target herself, a legal investigator who walked away from a 6-figure job because he couldn't sleep at night, and Jasmine, serving as executive director, unpaid, full-time. Its mission was razor-focused: free legal defense for whistleblowers, anonymous reporting frameworks, and immediate digital protection for anyone attempting to speak out from within government, defense, or intelligence agencies. No red tape, no waiting lists. Just one question: what do you need to stay safe long enough to be heard? Within 48 hours of going live, the inbox flooded. Some messages were vague, others urgent. A few included names Jasmine recognized from sealed files she was never supposed to have seen. She read every word, every cry for help, every line of fear written by people who'd seen too much and been silenced too often. Jasmine didn't just empathize, she remembered the weight, the loneliness, the risk of becoming a story before you could even finish telling your truth. But there were 2 names that never left her mind, 2 voices that had once tried to reach the system the right way, only to be buried beneath it. 2 people whose careers, reputations, and lives had been nearly destroyed so others could avoid embarrassment. The whistleblowers, the ones at the center of the surveillance case, the ones she'd defended without ever meeting face to face. Until now. She made no announcement when she decided to visit them. No reporters followed her to the modest private location where they now lived under protection orders. Jasmine didn't arrive in a suit. She wore a hoodie and jeans. She didn't come with cameras. She came with legal papers and her name signed at the bottom of every one. Protection, pro bono representation, medical assistance, and, above all else, recognition. The first witness, let's call her Leah, had been a systems analyst for a federal data retention project. She'd discovered metadata collection directives far outside legal boundaries. When she raised the issue, her clearance was suspended, her office searched, and her career ended in a whisper. For 2 years, she lived in limbo. No job, no restitution, no peace. She opened the door cautiously when Jasmine knocked. For a few seconds, she didn't say anything, just stared. Jasmine introduced herself, but she didn't need to. Leah already knew. "You're the reason they're calling me back," she said, her voice shaking. I didn't think I'd ever even be believed again." Jasmine nodded once, slowly. "I didn't just believe you," she said. "I used your truth to tear the roof off." They didn't hug. Not at first. It was too raw, too wide. But Leah stepped back and let Jasmine in. Not just into her house, but into the small, broken world she'd been living in since the system turned its back. The second whistleblower, Marcus, was a quiet man with tired eyes and a nervous gait. He'd worked inside a legal review unit for counter-surveillance protocols. He wasn't a leaker, he was a witness, and when he spoke up, internal memos labeled him hostile to operational continuity. They threatened prosecution. His home was raided, his children questioned. No charges were filed. But that wasn't the point. They didn't need to convict him, they just needed to silence him. When Jasmine met him at a safe location, far from the city, far from the headlines, he was hesitant to speak. Even now, even with proof of vindication. But when she handed him the signed exoneration letter, notarized and certified, he just stared at it, like it couldn't be real. Then he looked up, and there were tears in his eyes, but he didn't cry out of relief. He cried from something deeper: recognition, justice, grief that had finally found its voice. "I didn't think I'd live to see this day," he said quietly, "but you didn't just save me. You saved the system. You gave it a chance to mean something again. Jasmine didn't speak for a while. She didn't need to, because she knew what he meant. This wasn't about glory. It wasn't about clearing names. It was about proving the system could be watched. That power could be confronted without being destroyed, and truth could still be louder than fear if someone just held the line long enough. The SHIELD project expanded slowly but steadily. Jasmine refused corporate donations. She refused anything that even smelled like compromise. The funding came from individual contributions, small grants, and legal reinvestments from wrongful termination cases they won on behalf of silenced employees. And when they did, within the first 6 months, they'd prevented 3 retaliatory investigations, stopped 2 internal gag orders, and successfully reopened a case that had been resolved behind closed doors. But for Jasmine, it wasn't about the wins. It was about the walls not closing in on people trying to do the right thing. It was about building a shelter in a world that had once taught her truth was something to survive, not speak. She never forgot what she was up against. She never pretended the fight was over. But as she walked back to her small legal office after every SHIELD project consult, after every call with a terrified federal contractor or silenced analyst, she carried something new in her steps. Not weight, not fear, conviction. Because now, for the first time in a very long time, the system knew it was being watched back. And it wasn't being watched by journalists or politicians. It was being watched by someone who had stood before it, called it what it was, and walked away not to escape it, but to build a lifeline for the next person brave enough to speak. That's what Jasmine Crockett had become. Not a hero, not a rebel, not a symbol, but a shield. And sometimes that's the most powerful thing truth can ask for. But the work Jasmine Crockett started in a single courtroom didn't end there. Because when truth survives the fire, it leaves behind something even stronger, a law, 12 months to the day. That's how long it took to turn a moment into a mandate. In a packed congressional chamber under tight security and relentless public scrutiny, the final vote was called on what had become the most anticipated piece of legislation in a generation. The Transparency and Citizen Protection Act, a bill born not from committee meetings or backroom deals, but from the ashes of a trial that had put power on the defensive and made the country watch itself in real time. Cameras lined the balcony. Protesters gathered outside in freezing rain, holding signs with phrases that had once echoed through a courtroom. Truth doesn't need to shout. Justice can't live in the dark. We are the watchdogs now. The public didn't just want a law. They wanted a reckoning in writing, a protection that couldn't be redacted, a guardrail that didn't depend on who sat behind the bench. Inside the chamber, lawmakers sat stiffly, aware that every movement, every gesture, was being broadcast live to a country still skeptical. The weeks leading up to the vote had been brutal. Lobbyists had tried to water it down. Agencies pushed back on language. Some called it dangerous, idealistic, a threat to operational security. But every time an amendment came forward designed to weaken the bill, someone, usually a younger member, would rise and say just 4 words. Remember what she proved. And that stopped the arguments cold. Because Jasmine Crockett had already done what the law was now trying to ensure. She held the system accountable and walked away with the receipts still smoking in her hands. She'd shown what happened when whistleblowers were abandoned. She'd exposed the high cost of silence, and she'd survived the full weight of a machine that had tried to crush her, not for lying, but for telling the truth at the wrong time to the wrong people. The bill was sweeping. It required mandatory third-party review of classified whistleblower claims within 30 days. It created a federal digital shield program to prevent surveillance data from being used to retaliate against those who exposed abuse. It restricted the ability of federal judges to seal oversight documents unless national security risk could be proven, not speculated. It gave whistleblowers the right to directly petition Congress when suppressed by internal channels. And it made any willful delay of such testimony a federal offense. It was unprecedented. And it was Jasmine Crockett in legislative form. The speaker called for order. The roll call began. One by one, the chamber filled with ayes and nays. But the outcome had been written long before the numbers landed. Every eye in the room, Every viewer watching at home knew the bill wasn't just passing. It was being carved into history. When the final tally was read, the room didn't erupt into cheers. There was no applause, just a collective breath held, then exhaled. Because this wasn't celebration, it was relief and a silent promise. Never again. Outside the Capitol, the rain hadn't stopped. A small group huddled under umbrellas held up a cardboard sign with Jasmine's name on it. Not glamorized, not gilded, just handwritten, bold, and underlined. A woman in her 60s stood beneath it and whispered to no one in particular, "She changed everything." Jasmine wasn't there. She wasn't in the gallery. She hadn't issued a statement. She hadn't tweeted. She had nothing to say, because the bill spoke for her. It had already said enough. Instead, she was in a cramped community office 3 states away, finishing a legal intake interview for a housing case. She didn't flinch when her assistant slid a note under her door that read, "The bill passed. It's law." She read it once, nodded, then turned back to her client and said, "Let's fix this lease." Because Jasmine Crockett didn't need a podium to make history. She just needed a table, a chair, and a reason. And a year after the system tried to silence her, that same system had been rewritten in her echo. But even after the law had passed and the headlines faded, Jasmine Crockett's story kept moving, in small rooms and quiet conversations, and once unexpectedly, in the back row of a law school classroom. It was a late fall afternoon, the kind of day where the sky looked tired and the trees held on to the last of their color. Inside the law school lecture hall, the students were restless, fidgeting with coffee cups, typing half-hearted notes on cases they barely believed in. Most had no idea who the guest speaker was until she walked in. Jasmine Crockett entered without announcement. No security, no title card, just her name on the day's syllabus and a simple black notebook in her hand. The room didn't go silent because they recognized her. It went silent because they felt her, like the energy had shifted, like something real had just entered a space that too often dealt in theory. She didn't stand behind the podium. She didn't turn on a slideshow. She walked to the center of the room, set the notebook on the desk, and looked every student in the eye before speaking. "I'm not here to talk about the law in books," she said. "I'm here to talk about the law in rooms where it hides." And just like that, they listened. For the next hour, Jasmine didn't quote cases. She didn't cite precedent. She told a story, her story, not with grandeur or dramatics, but with the steady clarity of someone who had lived through something most people never even dare to imagine. Standing alone in a courtroom where the truth was the loudest thing in the room, and still not enough until you made it be. She spoke of sealed memos and unsigned threats, of whistleblowers left dangling while the system closed ranks, of walking into a federal hearing with no backup, knowing the judge in front of her had already made up her mind and doing it anyway. She spoke not like someone trying to impress, but like someone trying to prepare them. Because Jasmine knew what most professors couldn't teach, that justice isn't something you memorize, it's something you risk for. The room hung on every word. Even the students who usually sat in the back row, texting, were now still, eyes fixed. One of them, young, wide-eyed, not more than 22, finally raised their hand near the end. They didn't sound challenging. They sounded honest. "Weren't you scared?" the student asked. "Facing down a system like that? Weren't you afraid?" Jasmine paused, not because she didn't know the answer, but because she wanted them to hear it right. Then she smiled, not wide, not performative, but with a weight that said, "I've been there, and I still carry it." "Of course I was scared," she said. "Only fools aren't." The class leaned in. "But fear isn't the enemy of justice," she continued. "Compromise is. Silence is. That slow, polite shrug we give when the truth makes people in power uncomfortable, that's what kills justice, not fear. Fear just tells you the fight matters." No one spoke after that, not because they were stunned, but because they knew, instinctively, that what she had just said wasn't theory. It was reality, the kind they were all going to face someday, in courtrooms and boardrooms, maybe even in their own consciences. Jasmine didn't promise them it would be easy. She didn't promise it would be fair. She just made it clear. The system doesn't break unless someone pushes, and someone always has to be the first to push. She closed her notebook, thanked them for their time, and walked out as quietly as she had entered. But no one forgot her, because Jasmine Crockett hadn't come to lecture. She'd come to light a fuse. As the classroom doors closed behind her and her footsteps echoed down the empty hallway, Jasmine Crockett didn't feel triumph. She felt memory, the kind that never lets you forget why you stood up in the first place. She remembered what it felt like to walk into that hearing room for the first time, not as a star witness, not as a symbol, but as a target. The emails had warned her. The messages had told her not to go through with it. They tried to remind her of everything she had to lose, her license, her safety, her future, and yet she walked in anyway, alone, with a plain gray suit and a box full of truths nobody wanted on the record. She wasn't powerful. She wasn't protected. She didn't even have a guarantee that she'd be allowed to finish her testimony. But none of that mattered, because there are moments when the cost of silence is higher than the cost of speaking. And Jasmine had hit hers long before the hearing was ever scheduled. What most people never saw were the nights before that moment. The way she sat on the floor with documents spread around her like landmines, knowing each one could blow her life wide open. The weight of knowing that no one was coming to rescue her if things went wrong. The way her hands trembled not from fear of lies, but from the enormity of telling the truth when the entire room was built to deny it. And still, she rose. She rose when logic told her to keep her head down. She rose when former allies distanced themselves. She rose when whispers warned her, "You don't win against the machine." She never stood because she believed she could win. She stood because she believed it had to be done, even if she lost. That's what justice demands. It doesn't call for the most powerful person in the room. It calls for the only one willing to rise while everyone else stays bowed. She had no seat at the head of the table, no title that guaranteed respect, no institution vouching for her intentions. What she had was paper, evidence, and a voice too steady to be dismissed as emotional. And when she spoke, when she said, "You wanted a source?" Her name is on this memo. The entire foundation shifted. Not because she shouted, not because she performed, but because she stood, exactly when the system expected her to kneel. The memory didn't fade, not after the law passed, not after the judge was suspended, not even after reporters stopped asking for interviews. That hearing room was still with her. The pressure, the eyes, the silence, the risk. That's why her answer in the classroom was real. Yes, I was afraid. Because only someone who's been there can say that out loud and still keep their voice from breaking. But fear isn't what stopped others. Fear can be felt and still walk through. What stopped them, what keeps systems broken, is comfort, is the shrug, is the compromise dressed in procedure, is the belief that someone else will eventually do what's right. But Jasmine Crockett never waited for someone else. She stood, and in doing so, she reminded an entire nation what justice actually looks like. Not robes, not gavels, not chambers full of rituals, but a single person choosing not to bow when everyone else is still pretending they don't see the fire. Justice didn't come from the top of the institution. It didn't come from powerful donors or carefully worded statements. It didn't even come from the law. Not at first. It came from one woman standing upright with shaking hands and a steel voice, knowing full well that speaking up would change her life, and not necessarily for the better. Because justice isn't safe. It never was. It's not comfort wrapped in compromise. It's confrontation wrapped in clarity. And Jasmine Crockett gave it everything she had. Not for applause, not for legacy, but for the people who would never make it into that hearing room. The whistleblowers that erased, the ones who tried to do the right thing and were punished for it. She carried their voices in that box. And when she set those documents down on the table, she did it with the weight of 100 stories that no one else was willing to tell. Now the law bears her fingerprints. Now the classroom carries her echo. And now every student in that room, every future attorney who sat in stunned silence after hearing her say, "Fear isn't the enemy, compromise is," walks into the future with one truth etched in their bones. Justice doesn't come from the most powerful people. It comes from the one who stands when everyone else stays bowed. And sometimes all it takes is one person willing to do just that. Once, loudly enough, so that the next time, someone else knows how. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. Jasmine Crockett, a calm, sharp civil rights lawyer, was invited as a guest, but was ambushed live on The View by none other than Whoopi Goldberg and her co-hosts, in a segment that felt more like a setup than a discussion. Weeks later, Crockett fired back, not with outrage, but with hard evidence. Overnight, the network's reputation collapsed, followed by a staggering $800 million judgment against ABC. How did one woman, with no platform, no spotlight, bring an entire media empire to its knees? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The alert hit every screen in America like a missile. Breaking: Jasmine Crockett wins $800 million defamation case against The View. In seconds, newsrooms erupted, live broadcasts were interrupted, and anchors scrambled for words. It wasn't just a lawsuit, it was a moment that broke the rhythm of the country. On CNN, the anchor's voice faltered as the headline scrolled in red. On Fox News, commentators paused mid-debate. Social media exploded. Hashtags like Jury Crockett verdict and media accountability surged to the top within minutes. In living rooms and diners, barbershops, and break rooms, people leaned closer to their screens in disbelief. The View, a talk show so deeply woven into the American cultural fabric, had just been defeated in court by someone the media once mocked and dismissed. A black woman, a lawyer, not a celebrity, not a media darling, but someone who had to fight for every inch of space she occupied. To the casual viewer, Jasmine Crockett had been nothing more than a guest. Another conservative voice brought in to be cornered, challenged, and chewed up for entertainment. But to those who watched closely, who noticed the smirks, the backhanded compliments, the orchestrated interruptions, this verdict was a long overdue reckoning. The injustice wasn't subtle, it was on national television. She had been condescended to, painted as a token, and told to her face that she wouldn't even have a voice if not for diversity initiatives. The audience had laughed, the panel had smiled, the producers had nodded behind the scenes, but Jasmine hadn't flinched. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't fold. Instead, she went home, called her legal team, and began one of the most powerful legal counterstrikes in the history of television. And now she stood victorious, calm, composed, and unapologetically right. News outlets called it the trial that shook the modern media. Legal analysts labeled it a new precedent. It wasn't just about the money, it was about humiliation turned into justice, about bias turned into consequence. In a media landscape where apologies are rare and accountability even rarer, Jasmine Crockett had just shattered a wall no one believed could break. Viewers who once accepted the game as entertainment were now seeing the rigged board behind it. The real question echoing across airwaves, on headlines, and in every stunned conversation was this: how did one woman, without fame, without favor, without fear, bring down a $100 million per year talk show and make the entire industry feel vulnerable? Jasmine Crockett didn't come from wealth or influence. She grew up in South Dallas, in a neighborhood where opportunities were rare and expectations were low. Without family connections or financial support, she worked her way through law school, studying during the day, waiting tables at night. From the start of her legal career, she faced constant bias. Judges assumed she was an assistant. Clients asked if she was the intern. Colleagues doubted her, not because of her skills, but because of what she looked like and where she came from. Still, she kept going. Her first big case was against a powerful real estate firm, and she won. No cameras, no headlines, just a quiet, hard-fought victory. One case turned into many. Step by step, she built a reputation as someone who didn't back down, even when the odds were stacked high. So when The View tried to tear her down on national television, they didn't see the years of quiet resilience behind her calm smile. With a quiet track record of courtroom victories and a reputation built on substance, not spectacle, Jasmine Crockett finally stepped into a national spotlight. Unaware that this time, the battle wouldn't be fought in a courtroom, but on a soundstage dressed as one. Jasmine Crockett was invited to The View as an honored guest, asked to weigh in on two weighty topics: a new federal bill addressing racial and gender equity, and the ongoing debate around systemic privilege in American institutions. It was billed as a respectful conversation, a platform for informed voices across the aisle. Jasmine came prepared like she always did. Briefing binder in hand, legal precedent highlighted, statistical data memorized. She wore a simple navy suit, no frills makeup, and the quiet confidence of someone ready to debate policy, not parry insults. Her intent was clear: to speak truthfully about law, to represent those who rarely get the microphone, and to rise above partisanship. What she didn't know was that, behind the scenes, producers had mapped out something very different. Segments were tightly scripted. Host questions were pre-written with trigger points. Off-camera instructions circled the stage like storm clouds. Jasmine wasn't walking into a dialogue. She was walking into a carefully staged takedown, dressed up as daytime television. And every smile she was greeted with hid the same sharp edge. This was never meant to be a conversation. It was meant to be a trap. But the moment Jasmine Crockett stepped onto that glossy stage, it became painfully clear. This wasn't a platform for discourse. It was a performance, and she had been cast as the foil. From the instant the lights came up and the music faded out, something about the room felt off. The smiles were there, perfectly timed and camera-ready, but hollow. Eyes that didn't warm, expressions that seemed more rehearsed than real. Jasmine sat upright, calm and focused, her binder of notes neatly arranged in front of her. She was ready to talk policy, prepared to speak clearly, respectfully, and directly about legal reform and social equity. But across the table, body language told another story. Arms folded just a little too tightly, eyes scanning her with polite tension. The tone wasn't welcoming. It was cautious, guarded, like a group ready to circle the wagons, not share the stage. Then Joy Behar leaned in, just enough to command the camera's full attention, and delivered the first line that shifted the tone from cold to cutting. Joy Behar, the longest-serving co-host of The View, known for her sharp tongue and biting wit, had built a career on towing the line between humor and hostility. She smiled as she spoke, but there was no mistaking the edge in her words. "I guess Jasmine's here today because she's trendy," she said, with a tone that mocked more than it questioned. The audience gave a weak, confused chuckle, the kind of laughter that lingers too long in silence. It wasn't a question. It wasn't even a joke. It was a dismissal wrapped in fake warmth, a subtle but public way of saying Jasmine didn't belong. Jasmine didn't flinch. She held her posture, her silence more powerful than any retort. But in that moment, before a single topic had been discussed, the stage had been set. This wasn't going to be a conversation. It was going to be a controlled takedown. If Joy Behar's remark was a jab disguised as humor, what came next was a direct hit, delivered with a smile and dressed in the language of professionalism. Sunny Hostin, a former federal prosecutor and one of The View's most vocal commentators on race and justice, sat just a few feet from Jasmine. With her polished tone and legal background, Sunny often carried an air of authority that made her words land with extra weight. She didn't need to raise her voice. She knew how to make a statement sound like truth. She adjusted her posture slightly, her expression unreadable, then spoke with calm, deliberate control. "Let's not pretend this is about qualifications," she said, letting each word hang in the air like a closing argument. A brief pause followed, not out of hesitation, but for effect. "She's just the result of a diversity hire, isn't she?" The impact was immediate. Her voice was steady, her delivery professional. But the accusation was anything but neutral. It wasn't a question. It was a verdict. In one breath, Sunny erased Jasmine's credentials, her hard-earned experience, and her right to be there. The room tightened. A few awkward chuckles broke the silence, but most of the audience simply watched, quiet, uncertain, complicit. None of the co-hosts objected. No one interrupted. Jasmine sat still, her eyes fixed ahead, her body unmoved. Inside, she knew the drill. This wasn't the first time her achievements had been reduced to optics. But this time, it was happening live, on national television, from someone who claimed to stand for justice. And in that moment, the weight of Sonny Hostin's words didn't just bruise. It confirmed exactly what Jasmine had suspected walking into that studio. The game had been rigged long before the cameras ever started rolling. Whoopi Goldberg, the anchor of The View, had been silent through the tension, watching, listening, arms crossed in her usual pose of quiet authority. She had built her name on honesty, on saying the hard things no one else would, and she wasn't about to hold back now. As the oldest and most experienced voice at the table, when she leaned forward, the entire room seemed to tilt with her. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her tone was flat, slow, deliberate, the kind of calm that feels colder than anger. She looked directly at Jasmine, expression steady, and spoke clearly. "Let's be real," she said. "If it weren't for diversity programs, you wouldn't be sitting here right now." There was no emotion in her voice, just the weight of certainty. "This seat, it didn't come from experience. It came from a checklist." She let the words sit. No one interrupted. Jasmine didn't move. Then Whoopi went on, her tone never changing. "I've seen a lot of talented people get passed over," she said. "People who've put in years of work and never got this kind of platform." She didn't name names. She didn't need to. "You walked in with a nice resume, sure, but let's not act like that's why you're here." And then, with a small shake of her head, she added, "You were invited because you look good on paper and on camera. That's it." She leaned back slowly, folded her arms again, and didn't say another word. The message was clear. She wasn't asking for a response. She was closing the door. The insults had been delivered, one after another, but Jasmine didn't rise to meet them, and that silence spoke louder than anything she could have said. The camera slowly moved in, closing the distance between the audience and Jasmine's face. The studio was dead quiet. No one said a word. All eyes were on her, waiting, expecting her to break, to argue back, to show even the smallest crack. But Jasmine stayed still. Her face didn't twist. She didn't sigh or scoff or shake her head. She simply pressed her lips together, tight, steady. Then after a long pause, she gave a small nod. It was barely more than a movement, but it was deliberate. She didn't nod because she agreed. She nodded because she understood exactly what was happening. She had seen it before. And instead of fighting back, she let the silence hang. Not because she didn't have a response, but because she knew there was no point arguing with people who had already decided she didn't belong. Her silence wasn't surrender, it was control. And in that moment, surrounded by cameras, lights, and judgment, Jasmine held the one thing they couldn't take from her: her composure. The lights dimmed, the applause faded, and as the cameras cut to commercial, the real weight of what had just happened followed Jasmine off stage, like a shadow that refused to leave. As Jasmine stepped behind the curtain, the noise of the studio disappeared, replaced by the low hum of equipment and distant footsteps. The hallway was cool, quiet, and empty, like the calm after a storm. Her heels clicked softly against the floor, the only sound breaking the silence. Her face remained unreadable, but her eyes had changed, no longer measured, no longer neutral. They were locked in, focused. A production assistant, young and clearly nervous, rushed to catch up with her. She didn't know what to say, but felt the need to ask something, anything. "Are you okay?" she said, almost whispering. Jasmine stopped walking. She didn't look shaken. She didn't collapse. She turned to the assistant, paused for half a second, then gave a small nod and answered softly, "I'm fine." Her tone wasn't warm or cold. It was calm, controlled. A voice trained to stay level when everything else wasn't. Then, with barely a breath between words, she added, "Now I need to call someone." Her fingers wrapped around the phone, not out of emotion, but out of clarity. This wasn't about how she felt. It was about what came next. She didn't scroll, didn't hesitate. Her thumb moved with certainty, landing on a name she had memorized, not just because of who he was, but because of what he represented. Richard Monroe, former military prosecutor, now one of the most respected media litigators in the country. He wasn't known for making noise. He was known for making networks bleed, quietly, surgically, and with facts no PR team could spin. He had once stood alone in federal court and beat CNN in a case most attorneys wouldn't even touch. Jasmine had followed that trial closely, not out of curiosity, but because deep down, she knew one day she might need him. And now, that day had come. She brought the phone to her ear, her grip steady, her voice low. There was no tremble, no anger, just a tone sharpened by everything she had just endured. "I need you," she said. "It's already started." On the other end, Monroe didn't ask what happened. He didn't need details. Not yet. The tone in her voice told him everything. This wasn't a woman looking to fire off tweets or make headlines. This was a woman ready to fight the only way that counted. Not in the court of opinion, but in a court of law. Jasmine didn't want revenge. She wanted accountability. And she had just called the one man who knew how to make it happen. Jasmine hadn't raised her voice in that studio, but now, weeks later, her answer came in the language the network understood best: legal action. A few weeks after the segment aired, Jasmine Crockett officially filed a civil lawsuit against The View and ABC, and it was clear from the first page that this wasn't a symbolic gesture. The suit was structured, deliberate, and firm, backed by legal arguments, timestamps, and transcripts. It accused the network of defamation, citing that specific remarks made on air had not only been false but clearly designed to damage her reputation in front of a national audience. The legal team argued that these were not off-the-cuff opinions, but direct statements that misrepresented her qualifications, her presence, and her career. Beyond defamation, the complaint went further. It accused the producers of intentionally coordinating an on-air attack, using a scripted format meant to corner her with personal insults under the guise of conversation. Jasmine's lawyers stated that what happened was not accidental, not spontaneous. It was planned. The lawsuit described how the segment appeared designed to provoke a negative reaction, using calculated language and prearranged speaking cues between the hosts to create the appearance of consensus and authority. The most serious charge claimed that the entire segment had been orchestrated to trigger emotional distress, with the goal of turning Jasmine into a viral moment rather than a respected voice in debate. The complaint argued that the harm wasn't just reputational, it was strategic, and it was broadcast intentionally, knowing it would cause both personal and professional damage. The words may have seemed casual on the surface, but in context, they were part of a clear pattern of targeted humiliation. Jasmine wasn't just taking a stand. She was drawing a legal line that said, this wasn't journalism, this was calculated harm, and someone had to answer for it. But the most damning part of Jasmine's case wasn't what had been said on camera. It was what was said when no one thought the public would ever hear it. During discovery, Jasmine's legal team combed through hundreds of internal communications, emails, scheduling notes, production outlines, but one message stopped everything. It came from the team's Slack channel, a casual message thread meant for internal coordination. The tone was informal, even flippant, but what it revealed was anything but harmless. One line sent by a segment producer just before the taping spelled out the intent with chilling clarity. "We need drama. Let joy open. Whoopi will close hard." No discussion of topics, no mention of facts, just a strategy, step by step, character by character. It wasn't about content, it was about conflict. The message made clear that Jasmine's segment wasn't designed to inform the audience or challenge ideas. It was scripted chaos, planned to escalate tension, not truth. The legal team included a screenshot of the Slack message in the lawsuit. There was no ambiguity, no way to spin it. It showed exactly how the show's producers had treated her appearance. Not as a respectful invitation to speak, but as a chance to create a viral moment at her expense. In that moment, Jasmine stopped being a guest and became a target. They didn't just want conversation, they wanted a spectacle. And they chose her as the centerpiece. That one sentence became the centerpiece of the case. Not speculation, not opinion. Just a quiet digital message that exposed everything behind the polished smiles and camera-ready questions. This wasn't accidental harm. It was calculated humiliation, planned in advance and delivered on cue. If the Slack message showed the plan, what came next proved the intent, and it was captured in a voice that was never meant to be heard outside the control room. Among the evidence gathered by Jasmine's legal team was a short audio clip. Low quality, background chatter, almost thrown away in the noise of post-show cleanup. But what it captured changed everything. The voice belonged to a production assistant, recorded unintentionally as crew packed up equipment and reset the stage. At first, it sounded like nothing more than casual debriefing, loose conversation between staff after a long taping. But one line cut through the rest. "She's stronger than I thought," the voice said, followed by a pause, then, "But I think we got to her." She wobbled, just a little. It wasn't said with regret. It was said with satisfaction, like a challenge had been issued and met, not with facts, but with pressure. That sentence was not the voice of someone reflecting on a debate. It was the voice of someone measuring the damage. Quiet, confident, certain. It confirmed what Jasmine had long suspected. The segment was never about hearing her point of view. It was about breaking her down piece by piece, moment by moment, until the audience saw her not as a threat, but as someone defeated. And this assistant believed they had succeeded, not completely, but enough to walk away feeling proud. That single remark, buried in the noise, became one of the clearest signs of intent the case had. It showed the mindset behind the curtain, not curiosity, not balance, but control through humiliation. But the clearest evidence of premeditation didn't come in text or whispers. It came in full color, with studio lights on and microphones still clipped in place. Among the most critical pieces of evidence submitted was a backstage rehearsal clip, an internal recording used by producers for timing and host coordination. It wasn't meant for public release. It wasn't edited for image. It showed the hosts before the show, off-air but fully mic'd, walking through their segment like a cast preparing for a scene. Joy Behar sat with a notepad, flipping through talking points while muttering lines under her breath. At one point, she looked up and asked, "You want me to start light or just go straight in?" A producer's voice replied clearly off camera, "Start with a joke." Soft jab, just enough to get a reaction. Sunny Hostin was next. She rehearsed her line twice, shifting her posture and tone to land it without sounding too harsh. Her words were nearly identical to what she would later say live. No improvisation, just repetition. Then Whoopi stepped in. She hadn't spoken much during rehearsal, but when she finally did, her role was clear. "So I close it?" she asked. A pause. Then someone, possibly the showrunner, answered, "Yes." Keep it grounded, calm, but final. There was no discussion about Jasmine's actual policy views, no reference to letting the conversation flow naturally. It wasn't a conversation they were preparing for. It was a confrontation. The entire segment had been structured like a performance, and each host had been assigned a role. One to provoke, one to undermine, one to deliver the final word. Jasmine hadn't been invited for a fair exchange. She had been walked into a script, one where she was never meant to walk out with her dignity intact. And now that rehearsal clip was no longer just backstage prep, it was proof of intent. Taken together, the Slack message, the audio recording, and the rehearsal clip, what emerged wasn't a mistake or a misunderstanding. It was something far more deliberate. The evidence didn't suggest miscommunication. It revealed a design. Piece by piece, the puzzle came together, and the picture it painted was undeniable. This wasn't a talk show segment, it was a stage confrontation. Every detail pointed in one direction. The producers had chosen their target. The hosts had practiced their roles. The emotional cues were planned, the rhythm was timed, and the outcome was predicted before Jasmine ever walked onto that stage. From the outside, it looked like a panel discussion, but behind the curtain, it operated like a script. Each word chosen not for truth, but for impact. There was no interest in hearing her perspective, no room for honest debate. Jasmine wasn't brought in to be part of the conversation. She was brought in to be broken down, on cue, on camera, and on schedule. What aired to millions was packaged as journalism, But underneath, it was something much darker. A carefully engineered takedown disguised as television. Once the curtain had been pulled back on the truth, there was only one place left to confront it. Under oath, in open court, where the cameras couldn't be edited and the silence had to answer for itself. By the time the courthouse doors opened, the sidewalks were already full. News vans lined the street, journalists clustered near the steps with microphones in hand, speaking into cameras, with voices tight from the early morning chill. Every network was there. National anchors, legal analysts, columnists. Inside the building, the hallway outside the courtroom felt more like a press pit than a place of law. The wooden benches were packed. Reporters scribbled in notepads. Courtroom sketch artists leaned in, trying to capture every detail. And beyond the reporters and the flashing cameras, there was the crowd. Members of the public who had followed Jasmine's story from day one. Waiting for a seat, many of them turned away once the gallery reached capacity. Then Jasmine Crockett arrived. She stepped through the security gate without a word, her face calm, her stride measured. She wore a tailored black suit, crisp and simple, without jewelry or bright color. No makeup, no statement, no dramatics. Her hair pulled back, her hands empty except for a thin case file. There were no smiles, no greetings, only stillness, only focus. She moved through the crowded hallway without flinching, as if she belonged there. Not as a victim, not as a celebrity, but as a woman who had earned her right to be heard. No spin, no performance, just truth walking on steady feet. Not long after, the defendants entered, less like the dominant personalities the public was used to, and more like people hoping not to be seen. Whoopi Goldberg came first, her face mostly hidden behind large, dark sunglasses. She kept her head down and moved quickly, flanked by legal counsel saying nothing. Joy Behar followed, her posture rigid, jaw clenched, holding a phone in one hand she never looked at. Sunny Hostin was the last to enter. Normally poised and unshakable, she now looked tight in the shoulders, gripping a folder with both hands like a shield. None of them met anyone's eyes. They avoided the cameras. There were no waves to the press, no quick jokes, no friendly smiles. The mood was heavy, controlled, fearful. The contrast was sharp even before the judge took the bench. Jasmine stood alone, composed, carrying nothing but her case. They entered together but without unity, weighed down by silence and the gravity of what they were about to face. In the studio, they had held the power. Here they were just defendants, stripped of applause, cut off from editing rooms, and finally forced to sit in a space where truth wasn't scripted, where everything they'd said and everything they'd hidden was about to be brought into the light. But everything that had been said, implied, and denied finally came to a head when Jasmine's legal team pressed play and let the evidence speak for itself. The lights inside the courtroom dimmed just slightly as the screen came to life, glowing quietly at the front of the room. The jury leaned forward. Reporters stopped taking notes. Even the judge sat straighter in his chair. The video began without any music, no editing, just raw footage synced with internal production notes. The audio crackled faintly, a few voices in the background. Nothing dramatic yet. Then the words appeared on the screen in large white text, pulled directly from the producer's planning document. "She's the target today. We need viral." There was no commentary, no narration, just those 9 words, hanging in the silence like a confession. The courtroom froze. No movement, no reaction, just stillness. Jasmine didn't flinch. She stood beside her attorney, eyes forward, unmoving. The hosts at the defense table sat pale and silent, their expressions tightened as if physically bracing for impact. A long second passed, then another, before one small human moment broke through the quiet. A male juror, likely in his late 60s, blinked slowly and leaned forward in his seat. His lips pressed together, his jaw clenched, and then his eyes, already glossy, filled fully with tears. He reached once to wipe them with the edge of his sleeve. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't for show. It was the quiet, involuntary response of a man who had just witnessed something deeply wrong. Not a debate, not even an insult, but a strategy to publicly dismantle a person for the sake of internet clicks. That realization hit harder than any argument ever could. And for the first time in the trial, the room didn't feel like a courtroom. It felt like a reckoning. The judge adjusted his glasses, looked down at the documents before him, then slowly lifted his head. The entire courtroom leaned in. No movement, no whisper, not even the shuffle of a foot. Jasmine stood quietly next to her legal team, eyes steady, hands clasped in front of her. Across the aisle, the defendants sat frozen, their attorneys tense, waiting. The judge cleared his throat once, then spoke with firm, controlled authority. In the matter of Jasmine Crockett versus the American Broadcasting Company in The View, this court finds the defendants legally liable for defamation, targeted reputational harm, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The words rang out, slow and final. Then came the sentence that hit like a hammer. Damages are awarded to the plaintiff in the amount of $800 million. Gas broke out across the gallery, sharp, uncontrolled. A reporter in the press box dropped her notepad. One juror shook his head in disbelief. At the defense table, the shift was immediate. Whoopi Goldberg sat utterly still, her jaw locked, lips pressed together. Joy Behar lowered her gaze, staring blankly at the floor. Sunny Hostin leaned back in her chair, her fingers gripping the sides as if trying to ground herself. No one spoke. No one blinked. For a brief moment, it felt like time had stopped. Jasmine didn't raise a fist. She didn't cry. She just let out a long, quiet breath. A release not of celebration, but of justice finally landing after being held back for too long. It wasn't about money. It was about truth. And now that truth had a number large enough to shake an entire industry. The verdict didn't just end a trial, it triggered a landslide. Within hours, the weight of accountability rippled far beyond the courtroom walls, and the empire that once mocked Jasmine Crockett began to collapse under the truth it tried to bury. The ruling had barely made its way across news tickers when the first cracks in ABC's foundation began to show. By noon the next day, nearly 70% of the network's national advertising contracts had been frozen or pulled entirely. Major sponsors, household names, wanted distance, not explanations. Executives scrambled to issue statements, but the silence from advertisers said more than any PR spin could. Inside ABC headquarters, emergency meetings ran around the clock. Phones rang nonstop. What had once been a confident media machine now moved like a ship taking on water. One insider, speaking to the press under condition of anonymity, summed it up with brutal clarity. We underestimated the wrong woman. It wasn't said in anger. It was said in awe and fear. The impact was swift and public. The View, long considered untouchable in the world of daytime television, was placed on indefinite suspension less than 48 hours after the verdict. The phrase used in the press release was sterile, corporate, but everyone knew what it meant. Production stopped. Cameras were packed away. Studio lights stayed off. The audience who once laughed on cue had vanished, replaced by headlines that no one at ABC could control. Internally, morale crumbled. Staffers were told to stay home. Reruns were pulled. Affiliate networks demanded answers. What had started as a single lawsuit had now triggered a network-wide identity crisis, and no one knew what might be left standing. Behind closed doors, the fallout was even more dramatic. One host, her name withheld from the public for privacy, formally submitted her resignation the morning after the ruling. No farewell post, no interview, just a legal withdrawal and immediate departure from all on-air duties. Another, reportedly overwhelmed by the pace and weight of the collapse, was quietly admitted to a private care facility for what sources later described as acute psychological distress. ABC issued a one-line statement asking for privacy, but the damage was done. The public saw what had once been the face of media power now shaken, cornered, and visibly unraveling. For years, The View had been seen as bulletproof, anchored by celebrity, tradition, and the illusion of credibility. But the lawsuit shattered that illusion in a matter of days, and now the network behind it all was staring at one of the largest financial and reputational disasters in its history. Viewers who had once tuned in every morning now watched news clips of producers being escorted out. Internal investigations were launched. Shareholders demanded answers. And across social media, Where the viral plan had originally been designed to play out, the message had been flipped completely. Hashtags like "We Stand with Jasmine" and "Media on Trial" dominated every platform. Memes were replaced by outrage. Clips of the courtroom verdict were replayed millions of times within days, each one a reminder that power doesn't protect you from accountability. It only delays it. ABC, a network that had built its brand on public trust, now faced a public reckoning of its own. Executives were grilled in boardrooms. Emails leaked, sponsors walked. Public relations firms were brought in, but none could undo what had already been seen, heard, and ruled on in court. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. A show designed to interrogate others had now become the subject of the nation's most relentless scrutiny. And at the center of it all stood Jasmine Crockett, not loud, not bitter, not boastful, just resolute. The woman they once laughed over on a morning segment had now delivered a blow so precise, so undeniable, that the entire system surrounding her had started to break. What made it more devastating wasn't just the money or the headlines. It was the clarity. The evidence had been overwhelming. The intent had been proven. And the consequences were no longer theoretical. They were real, measurable, and unavoidable. The View had tried to turn her into a viral moment. Instead, she became a movement. And in doing so, she didn't just win a case. She rewrote the boundaries of media accountability in modern America. The headlines screamed, the networks spun, and the internet moved like wildfire. But Jasmine didn't. She didn't chase the cameras. She didn't bask in the victory. She walked away from the noise and let the truth echo without her having to say a word. There was no press conference, no podium, no victory walk. While every media outlet scrambled for an exclusive and every camera crew set up outside the courthouse, hoping she'd stop and speak, Jasmine Crockett simply stepped into a waiting car and disappeared. She didn't live stream a reaction. She didn't give a speech. She didn't need to. Hours later, when the world was refreshing headlines and waiting for a soundbite, Jasmine posted just one sentence to her Twitter account. No hashtags, no emojis, no image, just 12 words on a plain background. Justice doesn't need noise. It only needs persistence. It wasn't a quote for applause. It was a truth carved from experience. Simple, sharp, and earned. And that was all. No follow-up, no comment thread, no interview circuit. While others would have paraded through morning shows and primetime slots, Jasmine chose silence because she didn't win for show. She didn't win to be celebrated. She won because someone had to remind the system that dignity is not a weakness. That silence, when chosen, is more powerful than 1,000 microphones shoved in your face. And that justice, real justice, isn't measured in retweets. It's measured in what it changes. And in the days that followed, it changed more than anyone expected. What Jasmine hadn't anticipated was the wave that came next. Not from the media, but from men. Not influencers or celebrities or activists. Men who had grown up watching talk shows casually chip away at truth and respect. Men who had seen public discourse twist into spectacle and who'd long ago stopped speaking up because they thought no one would hear them. Men who were used to being told to be quiet, to accept the way things were, and now for the first time in years, they were writing letters. Thousands of them. Handwritten, typed, emailed, faxed. Every format, every voice from every corner of the country. Some were only a sentence long, others were several pages. They came from veterans, from retired truck drivers, from teachers, steel workers, farmers, and grandfathers. Some were shaky with age, signed in careful cursive. Others were typed with all caps urgency and gratitude. But they all carried the same message: thank you. Not because Jasmine looked like them, not because she spoke for them, but because she stood where they couldn't and didn't blink. One man from Ohio, a 74-year-old former firefighter, wrote, "I watched that show with my wife for years. I stayed quiet. I knew something wasn't right. You proved I wasn't imagining it." Another, a Korean War veteran from Idaho, ended his letter with, "You did what I thought no one ever would. You didn't just speak, you made them listen." These were men who had seen too much to be easily impressed, who didn't write letters for likes or clout. But now they were writing to a woman most of them had never heard of just months before, because they recognized courage when they saw it. And because they knew that what she stood for didn't belong to a political side, it belonged to something deeper: respect, fairness, and the right to speak without being torn down for sport. Jasmine didn't post photos of the letters. She didn't need to. They arrived in boxes, bags, and bundles, sorted by her team, stored carefully in her home office. She read each one, quietly, in the evenings, with no fanfare. Because that was the difference. This wasn't a media moment. It was a cultural shift. One that didn't begin with shouting, but with one woman refusing to play a rigged game, and a generation of silent men finally standing to say, "We saw it too." Justice had been served in court, but dignity, that had been delivered in envelopes. And for Jasmine Crockett, those quiet thank yous meant more than any headline ever could. The letters kept arriving, but they weren't just thank yous. They were acknowledgments. Jasmine hadn't just won a legal case. She had become something far rarer in public life, a figure of quiet strength in a world that feeds on noise. In the weeks after the verdict, the media kept trying to define her. Some called her fearless. Others labeled her brilliant. A few even tried to reduce her to a political symbol. But none of that truly captured what she had become to millions watching from the sidelines. Jasmine Crockett stood for something that had quietly gone missing in modern culture: calm in the face of chaos. She didn't win by shouting louder. She didn't dismantle her opponents with viral outrage or emotional pleas. She dismantled them with clarity, preparation, and restraint. Her silence on that stage had spoken louder than their rehearsed lines. Her single tweet had carried more weight than their hours of airtime. And in a world desperate for reactions, she chose control. She became to many the woman who refused to be reduced. Not to her race, not to her gender, not to her party, and certainly not to a media caricature. What made Jasmine powerful wasn't how she looked, but how she held the line, held her ground, held her dignity while others tried to strip it from her. She was the rare kind of public figure who didn't ask for admiration, and somehow earned more of it because of that. And while the press kept looking for the next outburst, the next scandal, the next angle, the public quietly began to see her for what she really was: a woman whose worth was measured not in performance, but in principle. For older men, men who had grown up being told that strength meant silence, that pain was private, and that justice was often out of reach, Jasmine became something they hadn't expected, someone they respected deeply, not out of pity or trend, but because she represented what they had tried to live by their whole lives. Not noise, not vanity, not posturing, just quiet resolve. Many of them had daughters, some had granddaughters, and for the first time, they had someone they could point to and say, "That's what real strength looks like. That's what leadership feels like." And they didn't admire her because she fought. They admired her because of how she fought. With logic, not ego. With composure, not chaos. She didn't make it personal, even when it was personal. She didn't make it about her. She made it about the truth. And that was what changed everything. Jasmine Crockett had become, in the eyes of many, the woman men respected not for beauty, not for charm, not for volume, but for her immovability, for the way she stood still while the world tried to push her over, for the way she listened, endured, and responded only when it mattered. She had proven that strength wasn't loud, it was disciplined. In the age of reaction, Jasmine became the answer to a quieter question. What does real power look like when it doesn't need to scream? She showed that it's possible to win without becoming the thing you're fighting. She proved that dignity is not weakness, that clarity can cut deeper than insult, and that justice, when pursued with relentless patience, still has the power to break through even the most polished lies. And maybe that's why her story didn't fade, because in a world of heat, she brought cold precision. In a world of chaos, she moved like clockwork. And in a time when people were starving for something real, Jasmine Crockett showed up, not to be admired, but to hold a mirror up to an entire system and say, "I don't need your spotlight. I just need you to see what you've done." And they did. The courtroom, the public, the nation, and for once, they didn't look away. In the days following the courtroom verdict, the media world did what it always does. It tried to move on. News cycles churned. Anchors smiled. Networks shifted programming to lighter stories. But underneath the polished broadcasts and carefully worded press releases, something had changed. Something deep. Something uncomfortable. Because this time, the cameras weren't pointed at the next celebrity scandal or trending debate. This time, the cameras had turned inward. Jasmine Crockett hadn't just won a lawsuit, she had exposed an ecosystem. Not just one show, but a culture of production that had, for years, blurred the line between journalism and entertainment, between commentary and cruelty. Her courtroom victory was more than a legal judgment. It was a mirror, and for the first time in a long time, the industry didn't like what it saw staring back. Inside ABC, the fallout was immediate. Emergency meetings were scheduled across departments: legal, programming, advertising, public affairs. Top executives met behind closed doors, phones off, laptops shut, NDAs signed. The first directive came from the legal division, not PR. All editorial staff were to undergo mandatory review of segment development procedures. That had never happened before. Not after rating slumps, not after sponsor boycotts, not even after scandals. But this was different. This wasn't about ratings. This was about legal exposure. And that meant real consequences. Across competing networks, similar conversations unfolded. CBS, NBC, CNN. Even online-first platforms like Vice, Now This, and BuzzFeed News started pulling old tapes, scanning transcripts, and reviewing how producers briefed their talent. What had once been dismissed as tone or host style was now being seen as potential liability. Legal teams, once seen as the final rubber stamp on scripts, were being brought in at the start of editorial planning meetings. Showrunners who had previously focused only on pacing and delivery were now being asked to justify tone, framing, and language choices in writing. This was not business as usual. This was a system under quiet, reluctant transformation. Jasmine's lawsuit had been so precise, so evidentiary, that no one could pretend it was just a fluke. Her team hadn't relied on emotional outrage. They had documented structure, intent, and execution. And when the words, "She's the target today, we need viral," flashed across a courtroom screen, media leaders knew that if it could happen to The View, it could happen to any of them. So they started changing. Producers were retrained on how to prepare guests, especially political and independent voices. New briefing protocols were rolled out, requiring every guest to be provided with advanced topic outlines. Not full scripts, but enough to prevent ambush segments masked as open discussion. A new legal term began circulating in production rooms: prejudicial framing. It was something law schools had taught for decades, but now it was being discussed in studios. There were also policy shifts on editing authority. Editors who once had free rein to trim interviews for pace were now required to flag any cuts that could materially alter the meaning or tone of a guest's remarks. Internal content audits were conducted across all major networks, including ones not named in the lawsuit, and most notably, a quiet but powerful change happened in talent contracts. Hosts were now being held personally accountable for comments that could trigger legal action against the network. No more hiding behind the corporate shield. The message was clear: think before you speak, and speak like the cameras don't lie, because now the law is watching too. For years, many talk shows had relied on the same formula. Bring in someone controversial, hit them with unexpected heat, let the audience laugh, and ride the viral wave. The format rewarded confrontation over clarity, volume over truth. But now producers were nervous, not because they feared lower ratings, but because they feared becoming the next headline. Behind the scenes, there was resistance. Some showrunners pushed back, calling it overreach, warning that the soul of the format was being diluted. But their voices were losing power. The boardrooms had seen the numbers: $800 million in damages, and they understood that no personality, no brand, and no episode was worth risking that kind of collapse again. This wasn't just a course correction. It was a full recalibration. Viewers started to notice the shift. The tone of interviews changed. Guests were no longer talked over with snide jokes or theatrical eye rolls. Hosts asked more questions and made fewer declarations. The fake laughter track didn't hit as hard. The smug monologues softened. Shows that had long trafficked in performative outrage now led with context, not clickbait. And while critics called it boring, others called it progress. But perhaps the most unexpected impact wasn't on the hosts or the producers. It was on the next generation of on-air talent. Young journalists, commentators, and aspiring broadcasters looked at Jasmine's case as a warning, but also as an opportunity. She had shown that integrity could still win, that intellect didn't need to scream to be heard, and that the courtroom, not the court of public opinion, was where real battles could still be won. They saw her calm. They saw her silence. And they began asking themselves, what kind of voice do I want to be? And the most subtle shift, it came in the language people used when describing media, where once viewers had said they destroyed her, they now said she held her own. Where once networks said it's just TV, they now asked, will this hold up in court? Where once guests prepared for fame, they now prepared for survival. Jasmine Crockett hadn't demanded any of this. She hadn't given a single post-verdict interview. She hadn't asked for policy reform or written a manifesto on media ethics. She had simply held the line. And because she did, the systems that had built themselves on spectacle were now learning, however reluctantly, that truth matters, that fairness matters, that preparing to destroy someone on air might not be protected by ratings anymore, but punished by law. And though the change was slow, uneven, and often unseen by viewers, those inside the system knew the truth. The rules had shifted, permanently, not because executives suddenly found a conscience, but because one woman didn't bend, and the law stood beside her when the spotlight turned cruel. That's the legacy no network could ignore, not even in silence, especially not in silence. Long after the cameras stopped rolling and the news tickers moved on, her name remained, not in hashtags or headlines, but in something deeper. Jasmine Crockett had stepped into a storm designed to break her and walked out with more than a verdict. What she left behind wasn't just a legal precedent, it was a blueprint, a model, a reminder that strength doesn't always look like shouting across a table or flipping a soundbite into a slogan. Sometimes it looks like silence, stillness, composure when you're being pulled apart in front of an audience, and that kind of strength doesn't fade when the lights go off. It echoes. In classrooms, boardrooms, law schools, and everyday conversations, her story kept resurfacing, not as gossip, not as scandal, but as example. Professors built entire lectures around her trial strategy. Legal scholars dissected the structure of the case and pointed to how it avoided theatrics and stuck to verifiable facts. Media studies departments rewrote portions of their curriculum to include a section on her appearance, how a planned media ambush can cross the line into coordinated defamation. One Ivy League course listed her trial as a case study in modern dignity versus systemic spectacle. But it wasn't just academia that noticed. Young professionals, especially women of color, watched Jasmine's restraint with wide eyes, not because it was flashy, but because it was possible. They saw in her something the world rarely gives them permission to imagine, a future where you don't have to become louder or harder to be heard, where you don't have to match disrespect with rage, where you can stand in your intelligence, your preparation, your control, and win. She didn't play their game. She changed the board. In the months following the trial, a slow wave began to rise. Not loud, not viral, but steady. Young women entering law, communications, politics, fields where image often overshadows insight, began referencing Jasmine in cover letters and essays. They quoted her single tweet, "Justice doesn't need noise. It only needs persistence." Not because it was catchy, because it was true. Jasmine had given them something they hadn't seen in a long time. A way forward that didn't require compromising who they were to survive the spaces they entered. And then there were the men, those who had written her letters in the early days, and those who now taught their sons and grandsons about what she'd done. Some had never followed a trial in their lives. Others had stopped watching daytime television decades ago, but they knew when they saw something real. They'd seen too many people fold under pressure or retaliate with outrage. Jasmine had done neither. She had stood still and let the truth do the work. To many of them, she represented something simple but forgotten: honor. Not in the outdated performative sense, but in the deeply personal kind that doesn't seek attention, only justice. She had stood where many of them had once stood, alone, misjudged, dismissed. And instead of bending, she had calmly built a case so solid that even the largest media corporation couldn't wiggle out of it. That wasn't luck. That was preparation. That was patience. That was a masterclass in control. But perhaps the most powerful ripple effect of Jasmine's legacy was not what she did, but what she refused to do. She refused to gloat. She refused to humiliate her opponents. She refused to spin her victory into a brand. There were no book deals, no merchandise, no reality show pitch, no podcast tour. She simply returned to her work, behind closed doors or away from the spotlight, exactly where she had come from. And that choice, that complete rejection of spectacle, only deepened the respect people had for her. Because in a culture where everyone seems desperate to monetize their moment, Jasmine chose something else: permanence. Her legacy became a quiet weapon for the next generation. In courtrooms, young defense attorneys remembered her name as they fought to be taken seriously. In interviews, candidates remembered her posture, how she didn't interrupt, didn't fumble, didn't perform. In board meetings, executives remembered how she looked them in the eye without blinking, even when the pressure should have crushed her. She became a kind of internal compass, a silent standard. Not someone to imitate word for word, but someone to measure your own discipline against. And for all the talk about representation and diversity, Jasmine had given people something more powerful: proof. Proof that you could rise without alliances, that you could defend yourself without turning bitter, that you could beat a rigged system without becoming what the system expected. She had been underestimated, misread, set up, and still she didn't retaliate. She built, she planned, she waited, and when the moment came, she delivered the kind of justice that didn't just punish, it redefined. Journalists who had once mocked quiet guests as dull now feared mischaracterizing someone like Jasmine on air. Not because she would fight back with words, but because she had already proven what happens when the law enters the room with the truth on its side. She reminded the media that dignity isn't weakness, and that not every woman will smile when she's being torn apart. Some will remember, some will document, some will win. And in homes across the country, many of them without Ivy League degrees or law books, ordinary people felt something change. Not because they understood the legal mechanics, but because they recognized something ancient, something human in the way she carried herself. Quiet strength under fire. The kind of strength that can't be bought or faked or shouted into existence. The kind that comes from knowing who you are long before the world tries to tell you otherwise. This, in the end, was Jasmine's greatest legacy. Not the money, not the trial, but the blueprint. A way of winning that didn't demand you become someone else. A reminder that stillness is not silence, that calm is not surrender, that restraint is not weakness. She had walked into a room designed to humiliate her and walked out having dismantled the very foundation that allowed it to exist. Not with vengeance, but with vision. And because of that, her story didn't burn out like so many others. It endured, not in noise, but in memory, and in the way people now stood, spoke, and refused to be reduced ever again. Her legacy was more than a story of legal triumph or media fallout. It was a reminder, raw and unshakable, that beneath every headline is a human being fighting to be seen with dignity intact. Jasmine Crockett's journey peeled back more than the media's polished surface. It exposed a truth many had forgotten, that justice isn't just about winning a case, it's about recognizing humanity in the places where it's been stripped away. She didn't walk into that studio demanding pity. She didn't ask to be protected. She asked for respect and was given a trap. She answered it not with rage, but with law. And in doing so, she forced the world to reconsider how quickly we allow systems to humiliate those who challenge the script. Her story wasn't just about a takedown of power. It was a confrontation with how easily cruelty gets dressed up as commentary, how often public mockery hides behind production value, and forced laughter. Jasmine stood in the middle of that machinery, refused to flinch, and made the world look closer, not just at her, but at itself. The lesson wasn't abstract, it was painfully human. That even now, in a so-called era of progress and fairness, a poised, qualified black woman could be treated as spectacle the moment she stepped outside the narrative others had written for her. That a lifetime of achievement could be reduced in a single televised segment to fitting a quota. That her value could be debated not for her thoughts, but for her existence. And yet, she didn't break. That is the real victory. Not the courtroom win, not the money, but the fact that she never let the injustice reshape who she was. She responded with facts, not fury, with stillness, not submission. She reminded everyone watching that dignity isn't something granted by media approval. It's something you hold on to when the world tries to take it. This story wasn't about one show. It was about all the rooms where power goes unchecked. About every time someone is invited in just to be torn down in public. About how easy it is to create moments that entertain but destroy. Jasmine's battle brought something rare back into focus. That empathy must exist even where agendas thrive. That the truth must matter more than the edit. That words, when weaponized, are no less violent than action. And perhaps most importantly, that standing alone with the truth is still worth it, even when you're surrounded by applause that isn't yours. She gave us more than a courtroom moment. She gave us a moral mirror. And in that mirror, we saw not just what they did to her, but what we allow, what we excuse, what we scroll past every day in the name of content. Her lesson was uncomfortably clear. We can't demand justice if we stay silent when it's denied to others, especially when the denial is dressed in ratings, repackaged for likes, and repeated until it becomes accepted as just how it works. But she broke that cycle with one nod, with one breath, with one sentence typed quietly into the world. Justice doesn't need noise. It only needs persistence. And for anyone who's ever been dismissed, distorted, or disrespected, her message endures, not as comfort, but as a call. Hold your line, even when they try to erase it, especially when they try to erase it. Because in a world obsessed with shouting, Jasmine Crockett reminded us of something rare, something lost, something deeply human. That stillness, when grounded in truth, is louder than any microphone. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.